The Fighter Who Found Me, a love story told by Erica. I never planned on telling this story out loud. For years I kept it folded up somewhere quiet inside me, the way you keep a photograph in the back pocket of a jacket you rarely wear, not hidden exactly, just private. But enough time has passed now, enough good years have piled up on top of the bad night that started everything, that I think I can finally lay it all out from beginning to end. So pour yourself something warm, get comfortable, and let me tell you how I met Ethan. My name is Erica. I'm 35 now, though I was 32 when this all began. I still live, in a mid-sized city in Ohio, the kind of place with a downtown that's trying very hard to be trendy, old brick warehouses turned into loft apartments, a river walk that the city council is endlessly revitalizing. I worked as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm, the kind of job where you spend your days making other people's businesses look more exciting than they actually are. I had a 2-bedroom apartment 3 blocks from the river, a temperamental cat named Biscuit, and a stubborn, ordinary habit, of walking home from the gym late at night because I told myself the exercise on top of exercise was good for me, and because for 32 years nothing bad had ever happened to me on that route. That's the thing about safety. You don't know you're borrowing it until the bill comes due. It was a Tuesday in October, unseasonably warm, the kind of night where the humidity hadn't gotten the memo that summer was over. I'd stayed at the gym later than usual, some new class, hot yoga mixed with weights, whatever they were calling it that month, and by the time I stepped out onto the sidewalk it was almost 11. The streetlights along 4th Street had that orange, underwater glow they get, and the shops were dark, metal grates pulled down over the windows. I remember I had my earbuds in, half listening to a podcast about true crime, which in hindsight is almost funny in the worst possible way. I remember the smell of somebody's cigarette drifting from an alley. I remember feeling, for just a second, that prickle at the back of the neck that every woman knows and that most of us have trained ourselves to ignore because acknowledging it means admitting how often it happens. 2 men stepped out from between a shuttered pawn shop and a parking garage. I want to be careful here because I don't want to turn this into something lurid. This is a love story, not a horror story, and I refuse to let those 2 men have more space in it than they've earned. What I'll say is this. They wanted my bag, and when I didn't hand it over fast enough, wanted more than that, wanted to drag me somewhere less lit, somewhere the cameras on the corner couldn't reach. One of them had his hand around my wrist so hard I had bruises the shape of his fingers for 2 weeks afterward. I screamed. Nobody came. Except somebody did. I heard footsteps first, a steady, controlled rhythm, someone running at an easy pace, the kind of pace that says this is just an ordinary training run and not someone racing toward danger. And then there was a voice, low and absolutely certain, saying something like, "Let her go. Right now." Not shouted. Not panicked. Just final, like a door closing. I didn't get a good look at him in that first half second. I was too busy being terrified, too busy having the worst night of my life happen in real time, but I remember the shape of him cutting into the streetlight, broad through the shoulders, moving like his body was a tool he'd spent years learning to use precisely. The man holding my wrist let go to deal with this new problem, which turned out to be a catastrophic decision on his part. What happened next took maybe 15 seconds, though it felt like it stretched out much longer, the way car accidents do. I want to be honest, it wasn't some balletic, cinematic fight scene. It was fast and ugly and efficient in the way that real violence is efficient when one person genuinely knows what they're doing and the other 2 very much do not. There was a short exchange, a couple of strikes, and then both men were on the ground, one of them not moving much, the other one scrambling backward on his hands like a crab before he found his feet and ran. The whole thing had the strange, brutal grace of watching someone who had trained their entire adult life for exactly one purpose, finally getting to use it for something that mattered. Then it was just him and me on the sidewalk, both of us breathing hard, my earbud dangling from one ear, my podcast host still cheerfully narrating some unrelated cold case into the night air. "Hey," he said, and just like that his voice went from the ice-cold command it had been 30 seconds earlier to something gentle, almost shy. "Hey, are you okay? Can you hear me? Look at me if you can hear me." I looked at him. Really looked for the first time. He was maybe 6'2", built like someone who trained for a living rather than as a hobby, thick through the shoulders and neck in that specific way fighters get, a couple of days of stubble, dark hair damp with sweat from his run, and eyes that, even in that orange streetlight, I could tell were a warm brown, currently full of a concern so raw it almost embarrassed me to receive it from a total stranger. My voice came out cracked. I think so. I don't know. You're safe now, he said. They're gone. I'm not going to leave you out here, okay? Do you want me to call the police, call someone for you, walk you home, whatever you need, just tell me? That was Ethan. That was, in miniature, the entire shape of who he would turn out to be, someone whose body had been forged into a genuinely dangerous instrument, and who used every ounce of that danger in service of making sure the people around him never had to be afraid. I found out later that his full name was Ethan Cole, that he was 34 at the time, 37 now, and that he was a professional mixed martial artist, a middleweight with a modest but respectable record, the kind of fighter who wasn't quite famous outside serious fight circles but who any serious fan of the sport would recognize instantly. He trained at a gym 2 neighborhoods over and had a habit, much like mine, of running late at night to clear his head after long training days. Our paths had simply never crossed before in a city of that size, until the one night they absolutely had to. The police came. I gave a statement, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen. Ethan stayed the entire time, standing a respectful few feet away, not hovering, not making it about himself, just present, like a wall between me and the rest of the frightening world. When the officers finally said I could go, he asked, very carefully, like he was afraid of overstepping, if he could walk me the rest of the way home. You don't have to, he added quickly. I'd feel better knowing you got there okay. But if you'd rather I didn't, I completely understand. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I would have said yes to almost anything in that moment, but there was something else too, something under the fear and the adrenaline, a kind of recognition, like meeting someone in some old, quiet part of you already knowing they were going to matter. He walked me home that night, 3 blocks that felt both impossibly long and over far too quickly. We didn't talk about the attack. Instead, in this strange, tender way, we talked about ordinary things, where I was from, what I did, whether Biscuit the cat approved of strangers. He told me, almost apologetically, what he did for a living, like he expected me to be alarmed by it. So you hit people, I said, only half joking. For money? When I have to, he said. Mostly I train people not to need to. But yeah, when it's my job I hit people. Professionally. With rules and a referee and everything. Tonight there wasn't a referee. Something flickered across his face. I'd learn later it was something like guilt, an old habit of his of second-guessing his own strength, worrying that the very thing that had just saved me was also the thing that might make me afraid of him. Tonight there didn't need to be, he said quietly. I'm sorry you had to see that. I'm not sorry I did it. At my door, he gave me his number on a torn piece of paper, actual paper, from an actual notepad he apparently carried, an old-fashioned habit that I found unreasonably charming, and told me to call him day or night if I was scared, if I needed anything, if I just wanted someone to know I got inside safe. I didn't expect to use it. And then at 2 in the morning, wide awake, every noise in my apartment sounding like a threat, I did. He picked up on the first ring. Erica. Like he'd been waiting. I can't sleep, I admitted. I keep hearing things. Do you want me to stay on the phone with you? Would that be weird? Nothing about tonight has been according to the normal rules, he said, and I could hear the smile in it. I think we're past weird. We talked until almost 4 in the morning. About nothing really, and about everything: his career, the discipline of training twice a day, the loneliness of a sport that's fundamentally about hurting and being hurt by other men for a living, and how he'd started as a scared, overweight teenager who'd gotten into martial arts because he was tired of being afraid and had simply never stopped. I told him about growing up the only child of 2 school teachers, about a string of relationships that had gone nowhere because I always seemed to pick men who were, in one way or another, small in ambition, small in kindness, small in the space they were willing to make for someone else's fear or joy. Ethan, even on the phone, even after the worst night of my life, did not feel small. We started seeing each other properly after that, dinners, long walks by the river he clearly loved, mornings where he'd show up at my apartment with coffee before I was even fully awake, sheepishly explaining he'd been up since 5 for training and simply couldn't stay away. He was, I discovered, almost comically gentle for a man whose profession was violence, the kind of man who would carry spiders outside rather than kill them, who cried, unashamed, at his little sister's wedding video, who spoke to waitstaff and gym janitors and everyone in between with the exact same easy respect. How do you go from that, I asked him once, half joking, gesturing at him generally, to this? You beat a man half unconscious on a sidewalk and then you cried during a golden retriever video today. "They're not opposites," he said, thinking about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "The fighting was never about hurting people. It's about being strong enough that I never have to feel helpless again, and strong enough that other people don't have to either. Being gentle is the whole point of being strong. Otherwise, what's the strength even for?" I fell in love with him slowly, and then all at once, the way people always say it happens and that I'd always privately thought was a cliché until it happened to me. It was in the way he remembered that I liked my coffee too sweet and never once tried to fix that about me. It was in the way he showed up to every single one of my work deadlines with takeout, not because I asked, but because he'd simply noticed the pattern of my stress and decided to do something about it. It was in the fight I finally went to see him in 3 months after we met, and the way even mid-fight, even with an opponent trying his level best to take his head off, his eyes found me in the crowd between rounds just for a second, just to check I was there before going back to the business of being dangerous. We were together 7 months before he told me he loved me, standing in my kitchen at midnight, flour on both our hands from a spectacularly unsuccessful attempt at baking bread. "I love you," he said, like it had just occurred to him, and also like he'd known it for months and had simply been waiting for the right unglamorous moment to say it. "I love you, and I don't know how to say it smaller than that, so I'm not going to try." I said it back. Of course I said it back. I wish I could tell you that was the end of the trouble, that the 2 men on that sidewalk simply vanished from our lives once the police report was filed. But the truth, which I only learned in pieces over the following months, was more complicated and considerably more dangerous. The men who'd attacked me weren't strangers acting alone. They were low-level enforcers connected to a wider criminal network that ran protection rackets and worse across several neighborhoods on the east side of the city, the kind of organization that thrives specifically because ordinary people are too frightened to say anything about it. And the man Ethan had put on the ground hardest that night, the one who hadn't gotten up right away, turned out to be the nephew of a man everyone in certain circles simply called Mr. Rusnak, an old, careful, dangerous man who had run that particular corner of the city's underworld for over 2 decades without ever once seeing the inside of a courtroom. Ethan hadn't just embarrassed some random criminal. He'd humiliated a made man's family in public on a well-lit street, in front of police who'd taken statements and filed reports. That was not a thing men like Rusnak forgave. It started small. A brick through the window of Ethan's gym. Someone slashing the tires of his truck in a parking garage with security cameras that, of course, had malfunctioned that particular night. Then it got less small. A man approached me outside my office one afternoon, polite as anything, and told me with a smile that never touched his eyes, that it would be a shame if something happened to a pretty girl like me, and that Ethan should really learn to mind which fights he picked. I didn't tell Ethan at first. I was so afraid of what he'd do. Afraid he'd go looking for a fight he couldn't win with his fists, against men who didn't fight fair and didn't fight alone. But he found out anyway because that's who he was. He noticed I'd gone quiet, noticed I'd started flinching at loud noises again the way I had right after the attack, and he sat me down and simply didn't let me leave the conversation until I told him everything. I have never before or since seen him that angry. Not loud, he was never loud, but very, very still. The particular stillness of a dangerous man deciding, with total discipline, not to act on the first thing he wanted to do. "I'm not going to let anyone touch you," he said. "But I'm also not going to solve this by getting myself killed in some alley trying to be a hero. We do this smart." And that's what we did. Ethan went to the police formally with everything, the brick, the tires, the man who'd approached me. He talked to his manager, who it turned out had connections of his own in the city, people who understood how to apply the kind of pressure that mattered. Reporters interested in a story about organized crime intimidating a well-known local athlete, a detective who'd been trying to build a racketeering case against Rusnak's organization for years and had never had a witness willing to go on record before. For a while, things got worse before they got better. There was a night, I still have trouble sleeping if I think about it too hard, when 2 men followed Ethan's truck for miles after a training session, until he deliberately drove straight to the police station and simply sat in the parking lot until they gave up and left. There was a week where I stayed at my parents' house 2 hours away because Ethan insisted, gently but immovably, that he needed to know I was safe while things got sorted out, even though every night apart from him felt like missing a limb. But Ethan was patient in the way that only someone who has spent a career training for fights that might not happen for months can be patient. He didn't seek revenge. He built a case, piece by piece, alongside people who actually knew how to make that kind of thing stick. He testified. I testified. Other witnesses, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this kind of public high-profile push to finally come forward themselves. Safety in numbers, safety in a professional fighter willing to stand in a courtroom and say plainly what had happened and who was responsible. It took the better part of a year. There were nights I was so afraid I could barely function, and nights Ethan held me and told me in that low, certain voice, the same one he'd used on that sidewalk the night we met, "You're safe. I'm not going anywhere. This ends with us, okay, I promise you that." And somehow, impossibly, I believed him every single time because he had never once given me a reason not to. Mr. Rusnak and 4 of his associates, including the nephew Ethan had put on the ground that first night, were indicted on a long list of charges 18 months after the night we met: racketeering, extortion, and, thanks to my statement and the statements of 2 other women who came forward once they saw it was possible to do so safely, attempted assault. The trial took months. I sat through almost all of it, Ethan's hand wrapped around mine on the hard wooden benches, and when the verdicts finally came back guilty on nearly every count, I cried so hard I could barely see, and Ethan just held on to me and let me, not saying a word because some things don't need narrating, they just need to be survived together. After that, slowly, our lives simply became normal in a way I hadn't dared hope for. Ethan kept fighting. He had, by then, worked his way up to genuine local fame, the kind where people recognized him at the grocery store, and he handled that fame the exact same way he handled everything else, with an easy, grounded humility that never once curdled into arrogance. I kept designing, though I switched firms eventually, moved into work I found more meaningful. Biscuit the cat, for the record, eventually and grudgingly decided Ethan was acceptable, which from a cat is essentially a wedding blessing. He proposed on the 3rd anniversary of the night we met, not on the sidewalk itself, thank God he had better taste than that, but at the little Italian restaurant 3 blocks from it, at the same table where we'd had our first real dinner together. He got down on one knee in the middle of the restaurant, hands shaking slightly, this man who had never once shown fear in front of 2 armed strangers or a boxing ring full of people trying to hurt him, and he could barely get the words out. "I've spent my whole life training to be strong enough that nobody I love ever has to be afraid," he said. "I want to spend the rest of it actually doing that. For you. Erica, will you marry me?" I said yes so fast I nearly cut him off. The whole restaurant applauded. Somewhere in the back, I'm fairly sure our waiter, who'd served us on that very first date, was crying almost as hard as I was. We got married the following spring, a small outdoor ceremony by the same river we used to walk along, string lights in the trees, his enormous, warm, chaotic family from 3 different states mixing with my quieter one, everyone dancing badly and happily late into the night. My father, giving a small toast, said that he'd never in his life felt as safe handing his daughter to another person as he did handing me to a man who'd once run headfirst into danger for a total stranger and never once asked for anything in return. Ethan retired from active competition 2 years ago, not because he had to, but because, as he told me, he'd found something worth protecting that mattered more to him than any title ever could. He runs the gym now, full-time, training a whole new generation of fighters, and there's a particular kind of pride I feel watching him teach, watching him take some scared, overweight teenager who reminds him powerfully of himself at that age, and slowly, patiently, turn fear into strength and strength into gentleness, exactly the way it happened for him. We have a daughter now, 2 years old, a small fierce thing with her father's stubborn jaw and, according to everyone who knows us, my exact expression of skepticism when someone tells her something she doesn't quite believe. Ethan built her a tiny punching bag for her 2nd birthday, more as a joke than anything, and I have never seen a grown man look prouder than the day she hit it, off balance and giggling, and nearly fell straight over. Sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, old habits, I think back to that Tuesday in October, to the 2 men on 4th Street, to the 20 most terrifying seconds of my life. I used to think of that night only as the worst thing that ever happened to me. It took me a long time and a lot of Ethan's patient, steady love, to understand that it was also, somehow, impossibly, the beginning of the best thing. People ask us sometimes at parties, at the gym, wherever the story inevitably comes up, whether it's strange building a whole life, a whole love story, out of something so frightening. I used to think it was strange too. Now I think it's just true, that sometimes the worst night of your life is also the night you meet the person who spends every night afterward making sure you never have to be that afraid again. That courage and gentleness aren't opposites. The way Ethan told me all those years ago in my kitchen with flour on his hands. That real strength was never about what a person can do to someone. It's about what they choose to do for someone over and over for the rest of their life, long after the fight on the sidewalk is over and the only battles left are the small, quiet, everyday kind, the kind you win simply by staying. Ethan is 37 now. I'm 35. We've been together 5 years, married 3 of them, and some nights he still walks over, unprompted, and checks that the front door is locked twice, an old habit from a night neither of us will ever fully stop thinking about. I used to find that a little sad. Now I just find it love, plain and simple, a fighter still checking the perimeter long after the war is won because that's simply who he is, and because I was and remain the thing worth guarding. That's my story. That's how a run gone wrong on an ordinary Tuesday turned into the rest of my life. The end.